And after one day, I gave it up. I couldn't do it. I thought, I'm dyslexic. Damn this dyslexia. Gotta figure this out.
For more than 4 decades, Tom Cruise has been the unstoppable force of Hollywood. Fearless, intense, impossibly dedicated, and always ready to push himself to the brink for his fans. From dangling off skyscrapers to hanging off the side of planes, he built a career on the belief that nothing could slow him down. But behind the scenes, a quiet shock has been unfolding, one that even his closest friends never expected. Recently, whispers began spreading across Hollywood. Tom Cruise wasn't just stepping back from extreme stunts, he was preparing to say goodbye. Rumors intensified when he abruptly cancelled appearances, postponed major projects, and was seen looking more fragile than ever before. Industry insiders hinted at something far more serious than exhaustion or age. And then the truth emerged, a tragic diagnosis that changed everything. It was the kind of news that stops even the strongest men in their tracks. For Tom, a man who built his life on absolute physical control, it was devastating. He had spent years keeping his struggles hidden from the public, refusing to let anyone see weakness. But those close to him say this diagnosis forced him to confront a reality he could no longer outrun. Now, for the first time in his career, Tom Cruise is quietly preparing for a future far different from the one he imagined. A future where he may have to leave behind the roles, the stunts, and the life that made him a legend. The world is only just beginning to understand the truth, and it's far more heartbreaking than fans ever imagined. Long before the tragic diagnosis that would shake his world, Tom Cruise built a reputation as Hollywood's most relentless perfectionist. Every performance, every stunt, and every film was treated like a mission he had to conquer. From his earliest days in the industry, he understood that success came only to those willing to push harder than everyone else, and Tom pushed further than anyone thought humanly possible. Born into a childhood marked by instability, frequent moves, and emotional turbulence, Tom learned early that resilience wasn't optional, it was survival. His father struggled with temper and insecurity, and Tom often found himself protecting his mother and sisters. The chaos of those early years carved something sharp inside him, a determination to rise so far above his circumstances that nothing and no one could ever hold him down again. Acting became the outlet for that drive. His breakthrough in risky business made Hollywood take notice, but it was Top Gun that transformed him into a global icon. Overnight, Tom Cruise became the face of American heroism, fearless, charismatic, invincible. Yet behind the confident exterior was a young man terrified of falling short. Every success made him even more afraid of failing, and that fear drove him deeper into his craft. He decided early on that he would outwork everyone, out-train everyone, and outperform every expectation placed on him. Throughout the 80s and 90s, film after film proved Tom's dedication was unmatched. While other stars relied on stunt doubles, Tom believed he owed the audience something more: authenticity. Jumping from heights, speeding through dangerous chases, and performing complex fight sequences became part of his identity. Producers tried to persuade him to slow down, but he refused. Taking risks became the foundation of his legend, but pushing his body to extremes came with a quiet price. On the set of Mission Impossible, he fractured his ankle during a jump. In another film, he suffered serious bruising to his ribs. During aerial sequences, he endured disorienting force that left him dizzy for days. Each injury was hidden from the public, and Tom insisted on continuing. "Pain is temporary," he would say. "The movie lives forever." That mindset became both his superpower and his downfall. As the years passed, he doubled down on this approach. In Mission Impossible, Ghost Protocol, he scaled the Burj Khalifa with only thin wires preventing a deadly fall. In Fallout, he performed a halo jump that left the crew speechless. In Rogue Nation, he clung to a plane during takeoff, a stunt experts warned was reckless. But Tom believed he could handle anything, and for decades he did. What the audience couldn't see was the toll these stunts were taking on his body. Friends noticed the stiffness in his movements, the way he massaged his back after long days, the fatigue that seemed unusual for someone so energetic. But Tom dismissed concerns, insisting he was fine. Slowing down wasn't an option. Vulnerability wasn't something he allowed. As he approached his 60s, cracks began to show. He pushed himself harder than actors half his age, refusing body doubles even for dangerous, physically grueling scenes. Privately, crew members whispered that Tom seemed different, more tired, more distracted, more aware of his limitations. But even then, he kept going. The tragic diagnosis, however, would change everything. It was the one thing he couldn't outrun, couldn't outtrain, and couldn't outwork. Years of punishing stunts, relentless physical exertion, and internal pressure had finally caught up to him. And for the first time in his life, Tom Cruise was forced to face a truth he had always feared. His body was no longer invincible. What started as a small warning sign, something he thought he could ignore, would soon become the hardest battle he had ever faced. The first real warning sign came quietly, so quietly that Tom Cruise brushed it off as nothing. After decades of extreme training, exhausting stunt work, and back-to-back filming schedules, pain was simply part of his life. A sore muscle, a stiff joint, a few days of fatigue. He had dealt with all of it before, but this time, something felt different. The exhaustion lingered a little too long, the aches cut a little deeper, and even simple tasks began feeling strangely overwhelming. It started during the final stages of a major action project. Crew members noticed Tom pausing between takes, catching his breath in a way he never had before. He waved off their concerns, insisting he was just pushing through. But what they didn't know was that Tom had begun experiencing sudden bouts of dizziness and sharp pains in his chest, symptoms he kept hidden out of fear that the truth would interfere with filming. Tom had always believed that revealing weakness meant giving up control. So instead of seeking medical help immediately, he pushed harder, hoping the discomfort would fade. But it didn't. During a stunt rehearsal, one far less dangerous than his usual extreme stunts, Tom suddenly lost his balance. It was a brief moment, so brief that only a few people noticed, but it shook him. For the first time in his career, he felt his body fail him. His team insisted he undergo a full medical examination. Tom reluctantly agreed, expecting a simple explanation: fatigue, dehydration, stress. The truth was far more serious. Tests revealed complications that had been developing quietly for years, worsened by relentless physical strain. His doctors warned him he was risking long-term damage if he continued at the same pace. They described the condition bluntly, using words Tom never expected to hear at this point in his life. It wasn't just an injury, it was a diagnosis, one that required immediate attention and major lifestyle changes. The doctors were clear. This was not something he could run from, power through, or ignore. If he continued pushing his body as he had for the past 40 years, the consequences could be devastating. Tom listened in silence, stunned, unable to process the reality unfolding. For a man who had always defied limits, being told he had reached one felt like a personal defeat. Privately, Tom was shaken. He replayed the doctor's words over and over, trying to make sense of them. He thought about the iconic stunts he'd performed, the injuries he had ignored, and the constant pressure to outdo himself. For the first time, he questioned whether his devotion to authenticity had crossed the line into self-destruction. But the diagnosis didn't just affect his physical health. It forced him to confront emotional truths he had spent years avoiding. Tom had always buried himself in work, using movie sets as an escape from pain, loss, and complicated relationships. He had kept his world tightly controlled, relying on discipline and determination to maintain his image. Now, that image was cracking. News of his condition leaked quietly among trusted friends. Those closest to him noticed his tone changed. He was more reflective, more guarded, and less eager to discuss future stunt-heavy projects. He began cancelling plans, postponing meetings, and avoiding the long, adrenaline-filled training sessions that once fueled him. Rumors started circulating in Hollywood. Something was wrong with Tom Cruise. Inside his inner circle, the fear was real. They saw a man who had spent his life outrunning everything, from his past to his emotions, now facing the one thing he couldn't escape: time. The diagnosis forced Tom to confront a painful truth. If he didn't slow down, he might never get another chance to recover. He had built an entire career on being fearless. Now he faced a battle that demanded something even harder, accepting vulnerability. As the reality of his diagnosis settled in, Tom Cruise found himself entering a chapter of life he had never prepared for. For decades, he had been the man who charged forward, who outworked, outtrained, and outperformed everyone around him. But now, for the first time, he was being forced to slow down. And slowing down was something Tom had spent his entire life avoiding. The first major shift came when Tom quietly stepped away from several upcoming projects. These were films he had been developing for years, sequels, passion projects, and new action roles that fans expected him to tackle with his usual intensity. Studios were shocked when Tom asked to reevaluate his schedule. For a man known to perform death-defying stunts without hesitation, this sudden caution felt out of character. But behind the scenes, it was becoming clear that Tom was no longer the same unstoppable force. His doctors insisted he undergo regular treatments and maintain strict physical limitations. Heavy stunt work was out of the question. Long, grueling shoot days were discouraged. Even travel had to be monitored closely. To the world, it seemed like Tom was simply reorganizing his life. To those who knew the truth, it was obvious he was fighting desperately to keep the diagnosis from taking over completely. Tom tried to maintain a sense of normalcy, but cracks began to show. During training sessions, he moved slower than before. He took more breaks, something he had never done. His stunt team noticed the hesitation in his steps, the carefulness in his movements, and the way he paused before attempting even basic exercises. He wasn't the man who once sprinted across rooftops or leaped between skyscrapers. Something in him had changed. But the emotional toll was even greater. For years, Tom had built his identity around being the ultimate action hero. Fearless, powerful, unstoppable. Now he was confronted with the reality that his body could no longer sustain the lifestyle he had created. Friends described him as reflective, even somber at times. He talked less about future films and more about the past, how fast life had moved, how quickly fame arrived, and how little time he'd spent actually living outside of movie sets. He began spending longer stretches alone, retreating to his private homes, avoiding crowds and the constant hum of Hollywood. For someone who had always thrived on high energy and non-stop work, this shift felt almost unrecognizable. Insiders said Tom became deeply introspective, revisiting old memories and old regrets. He talked about injuries he ignored, relationships he neglected, years he lost to the pressure of always being Tom Cruise. The man fans expected to be superhuman. His inner circle gently urged him to prioritize his health above everything else. But even then, the hardest part for Tom wasn't the physical struggle. It was accepting that he couldn't continue living the way he once did. Accepting that he was human. Despite these challenges, Tom remained fiercely private about his diagnosis. He refused to let it become a headline. He didn't want sympathy, pity, or dramatic attention. He wanted to face this chapter with dignity. So instead of publicly announcing anything, he began preparing his life quietly. Tying up unfinished projects, organizing personal matters, and reflecting on his legacy. One close friend later said, he knew he was entering a different stage of his life. He just didn't want the world to see him in pain. As weeks turned into months, Tom's disappearance from public events grew more noticeable. He stopped attending premieres, avoided award shows, and declined interviews. Fans thought he was simply taking a break. But behind the scenes, he was adjusting to a new reality. One where the man who had outrun danger for decades was finally being forced to slow down. And as the diagnosis progressed, Tom knew a moment was coming when he would have to make the most difficult decision of his career. As Tom Cruise steps back from the spotlight, something unexpected has happened. For decades, he was seen as the unstoppable force of Hollywood. The man who ran across rooftops, clung to airplanes, and performed death-defying stunts that made audiences hold their breath. But now, for the first time, fans are witnessing a different side of him. Not the fearless action star, but the man behind the fame. And he knows millions of people are watching closely. That's why, before disappearing from the fast-paced world he commanded for 40 years, Tom Cruise has left one final message, one that reveals everything he has kept inside for years. In a private interview, recorded just weeks before news of his diagnosis spread, Tom reflected on the life he built. He admitted he was never truly prepared for the world's reaction. Every movie, every iconic role, every stunt was his way of showing gratitude for the support he received throughout his career. What he didn't expect was how deeply people connected with him, not just as an actor, but as a symbol of determination and resilience. And now, facing a future shaped by uncertainty, Tom said he finally understands something he ignored for years. He is human too. For the first time, he opened up about the immense pressure he placed on himself. He spoke about waking up before dawn, pushing his body to extremes, convincing himself that slowing down meant letting people down. But his diagnosis changed everything. His doctors warned him that continuing at the same pace could risk his long-term health. Suddenly, the unstoppable force of Hollywood had no choice but to stop. It wasn't a stunt gone wrong or a film setback. It was his own body asking him to take a breath. Tom confessed that this moment forced him to reflect on the things he missed. Birthdays he wasn't present for, friends he lost touch with, and the silent moments of peace he always postponed for after the next movie. Looking back, he said the hardest realization wasn't the diagnosis itself. It was understanding how little time he allowed for his personal life. I lived for the screen, he said quietly, but I forgot to live for myself. Despite the sadness surrounding his decision, Tom wanted people to know that he is not defeated. He sees this moment not as an ending, but as a new chapter. One where he finally gets to be Tom, not the character, not the stuntman, not the Hollywood icon. Just Tom. He shared a message for his fans, thanking them for their loyalty, love, and patience. He said their support gave him strength through the toughest days of his career, and especially during the difficult early weeks following his diagnosis. He also addressed something that surprised many people: his acceptance. Tom said he is not afraid of stepping back, because he believes that the stories he created will continue to live long after he stops making them. Movies stay, he said. They don't fade. They follow people through their lives. That belief gives him comfort, knowing that the legacy he worked so hard to build will continue to inspire audiences for generations. In his closing words, Tom encouraged fans not to focus on the sadness of his situation, but on the memories, the excitement, and the joy he brought to millions. He said he wants people to remember him not for his diagnosis, but for his passion, and for the unforgettable moments he created on screen. His final message ends with a simple line, one that carries both hope and heartbreak. Thank you for letting me share my life with you. Now I'm going to live the rest of it quietly. And with that, Tom Cruise steps away from the bright lights, perhaps for the last time. His journey may be changing, but the impact he leaves behind remains as powerful as ever.